Ever wonder why you have to take a test to get a government job? Like, seriously.
It's a good question.
Well, get this. It all goes back to a disgruntled office seeker and a fateful gunshot way back in 1881. Crazy, right?
Yeah, and before we dive into that whole story, we should probably explain the spoil system.
Right, the spoil system.
Which, by the way, was a completely different way of thinking about government jobs.
Yeah, back then it wasn't about, like, aging tests or proving you have the skills.
Yep.
It was all about who you knew.
Absolutely. To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy.
You've probably heard that saying.
It was Andrew Jackson who really popularized that, and it basically became the unofficial motto for how the government hired people.
For decades.
For decades.
So today we're going to deep dive into how a president's assassination, a pretty dark moment in history, actually led to the end of this whole spoil system and paved the way for civil service reform in the U.S. It's a wild ride, folks.
It really is.
We're talking about a president shot at a train station, a vice president who kind of had a change of heart, and get this, even Mark Twain campaigning for reform. It's like a history thriller with a surprisingly happy ending.
Yeah, so let's get into it.
So set the scene for us. How did this spoil system actually work in practice?
Okay, imagine this. A new president comes into office, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically, they just start replacing tons of federal employees with their friends, campaign donors, loyal supporters, you name it.
So basically anyone they owed a favor to.
Exactly. We're talking everyone from your local postal worker to high-level diplomats.
Wow.
And all this constant turnover, well, it wasn't just disruptive. It actually made it really hard for the government to, function effectively.
So it's basically chaos.
Pretty much.
A recipe for corruption.
Yeah, definitely.
And just a whole lot of incompetence.
Oh, yeah, and we have this article from back then, and it really dives into how critics at the time were saying, hey, this is a terrible system. It's all about political loyalty, and it's preventing the government from actually, developing any expertise. And you got to remember, the government was expanding rapidly after the Civil War, right?
Right.
So all the problems with the spoil system just became even more obvious.
Yeah, so not a good look. It's funny, even Mark Twain, the guy who wrote Tom Sawyer, he couldn't resist poking fun at all this.
Oh, he had a field day with it.
I bet.
He's famous for this one quote. He said, "We will not hire a blacksmith who never lifted a sledge. But when you come to our civil service, we serenely fill great numbers of our minor public offices with ignoramuses." Twain always had a way of, cutting through the BS,
He did. So with all this criticism, did anyone try to change things?
Well, there were some early attempts at reform, like Rutherford B. Hayes.
Okay.
He ran for president in 1876 on this whole reform platform, but he faced a ton of resistance.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, the spoils system, it was so deeply entrenched.
It's like everyone was benefiting from it, except for, the country as a whole.
Right.
And then comes James Garfield, another president who, at least initially, seemed to be on the side of reform. But his story took a pretty dark turn, right?
Oh, it did. And that dark turn, well, it ended up being the catalyst for some major changes.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about Charles Guiteau, the man who assassinated Garfield. What drove him to do something so drastic?
Guiteau, he was the poster child for how messed up the spoil system was.
Okay.
He was convinced, totally deluded himself into believing that because he had done, a tiny bit of work for Garfield's campaign, he deserved a top diplomatic post.
A little bit of work.
Yeah, just a little bit.
And he thought that earned him a major government job.
He did. He really did.
Wow.
It was this incredible sense of self-importance, totally out of touch with reality.
And when he didn't get the job,
Oh, boy.
what happened then?
His entitlement, it just morphed into this, blind rage.
Uh-oh.
And he came up with this twisted plan. He actually thought that if he got rid of Garfield and got a hardcore supporter of the spoils system, like a stalwart, as they called them, into office,
Okay.
that he could somehow preserve this whole corrupt system. It's chilling. After he shot Garfield, he literally said, "I am a stalwart and Arthur will be president."
So he thought that by killing the president, he could actually strengthen the very system that, had disappointed him.
That's exactly what he thought.
Tragic.
And it gets worse. Garfield actually clung to life for over 2 months before he died.
Oh, wow.
The whole nation was captivated by this unfolding drama.
I can imagine.
It was all over the newspapers. And the assassination, well, it had a massive impact on public opinion. People started to turn against the spoils system.
So how did this shocking event, Garfield's assassination, actually lead to the downfall of the spoils system? So it's like this guy, Guiteau, his logic totally backfired.
Oh, it did. It totally blew up in his face. The public was outraged. I mean, they were horrified that someone could just walk up and shoot the president because they didn't get a job. And that outrage, it created this huge push for change. Even the people who didn't care about reform before, they were suddenly demanding a better system.
So what about Chester A. Arthur, this stalwart who Guiteau was so sure would keep the spoil system going? What happened with him?
Well, Arthur, now he's the president, right?
Right.
And it's all because of this horrible event.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what was going through his head, but you have to imagine he was shaken, right? I mean, horrified that his own political allies could be connected to something so awful.
Yeah, I can't even imagine the pressure he must have felt to do something, to respond to this public outcry.
Oh, it must have been intense. And that's where the Pendleton Civil Service Act comes in.
Okay, the Pendleton Act?
1883, just 2 years after Garfield's assassination.
Wow.
And Arthur, a guy who'd built his whole career on the spoils system,
Right.
signs this landmark piece of legislation into law.
Wow, talk about a change of heart. So what did the Pendleton Act actually change?
It was a game changer. It created this thing called the Civil Service Commission, basically a group of people who would oversee the hiring process for certain government jobs.
Okay.
And here's the big thing. They introduced civil service exams. So now, instead of getting a job because you knew the right people or donated to the right campaign,
Right.
you had to actually prove you could do the job.
So did this completely get rid of patronage in government hiring, or did it just, like, change how it worked?
It didn't eliminate it overnight, but it was a huge step towards a merit-based system.
Okay.
At first, the Pendleton Act only applied to about 10% of federal jobs,
Mm.
but it set a new standard. Like, it shifted the whole culture within the government, and it laid the groundwork for even more reforms down the road.
It's pretty amazing how one event could have such a ripple effect, but I'm guessing not everyone was thrilled about this new system, right?
Oh, of course not. Change is always hard. Some people argued that while the idea of exams was good in theory, they could be too rigid in practice. Like, could an exam really capture all the skills and experience needed for some jobs?
It's kind of like the debate we still have today about standardized tests versus, more holistic ways of evaluating people.
Exactly. And then there was this concern that even though the new system was much less vulnerable to political patronage, it could lead to a different problem: bureaucratic capture.
Bureaucratic capture. What's that?
Well, have you ever had to deal with an organization that's so obsessed with rules that they forget about actually getting things done?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That's kind of what bureaucratic capture is like, but on a much bigger scale. Basically, it's the idea that career civil servants, the people who've been in the system for a long time, they might become so stuck in their ways that they resist change or are more interested in protecting their own turf than actually serving the public.
I guess that makes sense. Experience is important, but you also need fresh perspectives, people who are willing to adapt to new situations.
Exactly. And of course, even with all these reforms, there were still cases of political maneuvering within the civil service.
Human nature, right? So we went from a presidential assassination to this landmark reform. The Pendleton Act really helped to create a more professional, more accountable government.
Oh, absolutely. Moving towards a merit-based system, while not perfect, really helped to develop expertise, reduce the chaos, and cut down on the corruption that was just rampant under the spoils system.
And that's something we still benefit from today.
Absolutely.
Now, our source material mentions the Hatch Act of 1939. It also seems to be about reducing corruption and making sure the government is impartial. What was the thinking behind that law?
Well, think about when it happened. It was the Great Depression, right?
Right.
Lots of economic uncertainty. People were worried about the government getting too powerful. And some people worried that federal employees might feel pressure to support certain political parties or candidates, just to keep their jobs or get promoted.
So the Hatch Act was about ensuring that the civil service stayed neutral, not influenced by politics.
Exactly. It put limits on what federal employees could do politically, like they couldn't campaign for specific candidates or use their position to influence elections.
So they wouldn't have to choose between their job and their political beliefs.
Right. And while it's been controversial at times, the Hatch Act is generally seen as a success. It helped protect the nonpartisan nature of the civil service, which is really important for people to trust the government.
So from the Pendleton Act to the Hatch Act, it seems like it's been a long road to create a more professional and ethical civil service.
You could definitely say that. There's been progress, but also setbacks. It's this ongoing struggle to find the right balance between efficiency, fairness, and being responsive to what the public needs.
And this didn't stop with the Hatch Act, right?
Yep. In 1978, there was the Civil Service Reform Act, which created new agencies and ways to manage the federal workforce. It's a story that's still unfolding today.
It's amazing how much we've learned about how to build and maintain a strong civil service. It's something we often take for granted, I think.
I agree. I mean, the system we have today, while not perfect, is the result of decades of work and reform. It really shows the American spirit is trying to make government better, more accountable.
And to think, it all started with a tragedy, a president's assassination that really exposed the problems in the system. It's kind of like a phoenix rising from the ashes, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Garfield's assassination was a terrible thing,
Absolutely.
but it forced the nation to look at this broken system and start building something better, something more just, more effective.
It reminds us that history isn't just a bunch of boring facts and dates. It's this living force that shapes our world.
And understanding the past can help us understand the present, make better decisions for the future.
And speaking of understanding the past, today we've seen how one event can trigger a chain reaction that totally changes how a country is run.
Makes you wonder what other seemingly small events have had huge ripple effects throughout history.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, one guy, desperate for a job, does something so terrible,
Yeah.
and it ends up changing the entire way a nation runs itself. Crazy.
It really shows how even in like the darkest moments, something good can come out of it. And it also shows, how important it is to learn from history, not just to avoid repeating the same mistakes, but to see how things are connected, how they shape the world we live in.
So looking back at everything we've talked about today, what are some of the big takeaways? What can we learn from all this?
Well, one thing that really stands out is how we're always trying to balance stability with adaptability. Like the spoil system, it
Yeah,
was awful, obviously. But it did offer a certain kind of stability, based on loyalty and connections, not merit. But it couldn't handle the fact that the country was changing, becoming more complex.
right. It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole. Eventually, it just doesn't work.
Exactly. And switching to a merit-based system, while a huge improvement, brought its own set of challenges. Like, how do you create a system that's both fair and efficient?
Right.
How do you keep bureaucracy from getting too rigid or self-serving? How do you make sure the civil service is actually meeting the needs of the public?
Yeah, it seems like finding that sweet spot is always going to be a challenge.
It is, and that's why it's so crucial for people to be involved, to be engaged. All these reforms we've talked about, they didn't just happen out of nowhere. People fought for them. Reformers, journalists, everyday citizens, they all demanded a better government.
It's a good reminder that we all have a part to play, whether it's staying informed, speaking up, or holding our leaders accountable.
Couldn't agree more. And it's not just about national politics. Think about your own community or even your workplace. Have you ever run into a situation where rules and procedures just seem to get in the way of common sense or progress? Like a taste of that bureaucratic capture we talked about earlier.
Oh yeah, we've all been there. It's so frustrating when you feel like the system is working against you instead of for you.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to ask questions, to challenge the status quo when it's not working.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final question to think about.
Today, we've seen how one tragic event can lead to huge changes in society. What other turning points in history have had a similar impact? What can we learn from those events, and how can we use those lessons to face the challenges of today?
That's a great question. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can find us online, on our website, and social media. We're always up for a good discussion.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with more fascinating stories from history.
Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.